Hello everyone, today we talk about early modern armies size. As you know, with Schwerpunkt we have dealt since the beginning with a comprehensive introduction to early modern warfare in all its sort of comprehensive parts. It's interesting how modern warfare is perceived in pop culture. There is, especially in the wargaming, say the old sort of pseudo-series wargaming community, the ones that produce also important volumes of greatly in-depth information laid out for purposes that, again, were wargaming, but basically even surpassed in only that kind of exception. However, some, in fact, academic compendia, in fact, are not really made. In fact, a lot of information, especially concentrated for ancient and medieval warfare, right? So times in history in which technically the differences between armies were scarcer, right? But that for some reason attracted more. And I noticed this immediately when I also started the channel, like way more attention than, say, a 16th, 17th century generic European army, you would say, but also those looked quite the same. Actually, they may have been even more homogeneous at some point down the line of pike and shot. In fact, modern uniformation, right, towards linear tactics, etc. This is also true, but on Schwerpunkt, we also cared very much to restore that proper national identity to every country, military culture that I think should be understood in that way. On the other hand, it is true as well that early modern warfare lends itself very well to some sort of kind of broader narrative of, say, apparent military, say, art of war taking off to some kind of greater degree in the acceleration of its development, etc. Think about the idea of the military revolution that, as you know, I've always been very, opposed to, conceptually speaking. It is true, however, in a linear, not even so linear sense, but say one that definitely accelerates dramatically, especially in the second half of the 17th century, which is also what, oddly enough, the military revolution, the infantry revolution stopped to, in a way. It's important to understand why those mechanisms kicked in that particular time in history. From one side, we have the impression, again, that is a bit more like the so-called mainstream, other term that I hate, that is Renaissance warfare was this, deeply incredible and unique and categorical improvement in the art of war, like in terms of sheer military power and performance, compared to anything that had happened in the Middle Ages. This is something extremely common, frequent. You can argue, of course, that during the Renaissance, certain things changed toward that direction. But given that also you found basically the only PhD that specialized is exactly in, not much, the only one who specializes in early 14th century, especially infantry, but not only warfare, because I actually like cavalry more, but that has this more, in fact, diachronic perspective that does not stop just to the Middle Ages or to the Renaissance, where most historians basically tend to because of hyper specialization, if anything, right? I just look at my courtyard and whatever is out there, I don't care, because after all I have to publish just about that topic. Schwerpunkt has always offered instead a much wider perspective, with the advantage of being actually soundly evidenced, based, focused, etc. on the sources, on the actual, even immense military history as well, which is another thing that is often too often neglected, especially if you're interested in the art of war specifically, because what are you comparing then? And how do you actually study the war of an era? Just through one battle, one generic example? Because this is also how often so-called military historians today really do, right? They pick one thing and they say, oh, look, this battle is important because here we can see this phenomenon that probably mirrors the entire narrative that we have of the era. But the narrative of about the era from a military point of view does not derive from somebody having actually studied all the battles or having spent his entire life, at least, in a specific region and generations of warfare, to the least. And even in those cases, actually very often skipping a bit. And that's how, in fact, also the concept of the military revolution, the infantry revolution came about, to be eventually fixed by the same people who brought it up, right? And instead, right, the best course of action is to look at what was actually all happening around, right? The smaller engagements, for example, even siege warfare that is often said, all these still in early modern warfare. As a matter of fact, siege warfare was very much there. There is even a sort of re-staticization of siege warfare to a degree. We made videos about this, but how many people do actually study sieges? I mean, like all sieges, right? Not just the bigger ones, that also preluding to, say, triggering the bigger battles, etc. Same with open field confrontations. We're all constantly told that pitched battle was so rare in the Middle Ages, also in the early modern age. They weren't, as a matter of fact, in the sense that there were at least many smaller open field engagements that are also not so small, right? But that since did not maybe occupy a special paragraph in a medieval or early modern chronicle, were one of the literally hundreds and thousands of engagements you can find for every region, in a single generation, that nobody has really ever studied, especially connecting them all together with this. I'm being a bit carried away, but from the main topic that is today organics, right? And the size of early modern armies in particular. The initial reference was exactly this, the notion that Renaissance armies would be some more advanced than medieval ones. If you actually look at the size of Swiss armies, even the battles of the Italian wars, you realize that actually our medieval armies of the late 13th, early 14th century were much bigger, right? And this notion, again, the thinking that the Middle Ages is just, the Battle of Azincourt or any other sort of engagement, turned out to be fairly small compared to the ones that were also being fought elsewhere in Europe at the same time, is unfortunately exemplificative of that sort of narrow take on the art of complete skipping of the art of war, and essentially a very provincial mentality also, as far as I'm concerned. I definitely dare call it like that. In any case, it's important also to understand, of course, what can be substantiated about the modern, the modernistic narrative that fundamentally the modern state was born and was more centralized. And before, of course, there was no centralization. This was what modernists always say. Of course, it's not like that. But definitely during the Renaissance, there is an improvement along a pattern that had already started during the Middle Ages. And that definitely does progress, does go on, right, in that military build-up. From the late 15th to the early 16th centuries, European monarchies accrued vastly greater financial resources than in preceding eras. Also about this, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that since a monarchy now could have more wealth than before, and this is also relatively debatable, right? If you go look at that video I made about the same aforementioned late 13th, early 14th century period, looking at the richest monarchies in Europe, how much they made. Actually, of course, it's slightly, it's not so difficult to compare it with the Renaissance, that is just a couple of centuries later, but it's like a very big thing. And again, the one that could field, in fact, much larger armies at times than, on a much more regular basis, even than what you see in the Renaissance, right? But it is true that what had happened in between, especially with the mid-14th century crisis, is that the populations of Eurasia, of the world in general, had basically been exhausted for many reasons, including the same wars that they had fought with a peak exactly in the era before the crisis. And today we tend to believe that the crisis occurred because of that, not just because, some rat brought, some pandemic across the world. That's not exactly, or that was, if anything, a consequence of precarious, for example, immunitary conditions due to the collapse of certain estates that, by the way, went down. They were same estates of the infantry that lots of people think that in the later Middle Ages exponentially rose in importance. Instead, it really didn't, and especially it started doing so from the mid-15th century in very specific fashion that was now controlled by the greatest powers in Europe. And that required, in fact, a much more concentrated power, even for the more egalitarian Swiss, telling the truth. And that were, in fact, a matter of also technicality, meaning that in order to have an effective, especially pike and shot, this is also true for the majority of pikes, for example, that can move and advance and even attack the enemy cavalry, etc., which was not the case for the previous infantries. That speaks of an enormous amount of wealth put in common without the concentration of power politically in the Renaissance would have not really occurred. What emerges with pike and shot warfare, you have them all across Europe, is essentially princely, monarchic, statal armies, right? There aren't free peasants going anywhere, etc. And that pattern is very, 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 very clear, right? So if anything, you have monarchies that gradually have monarchies of different kind, right? They can be actually republics as states, they can be bigger historical monarchies, and also different stuff. And the common denominator is power concentration at the expense also of local autonomies, right? Because these people understand, by the way, of course, it's a consensual thing largely, because no government exists without the decisive moral majority of the people, meaning that even if maybe the majority complains, they literally do not complain, or they're not motivated to actually change government ipso facto, and they're actually the weakest element, also because they do not understand why they should back a greater power with which they can rest also to their enemies, their outer competitors, etc. But let's skip this strictly political aspect. This does translate into a military into a matter of military power and real armies size as a point. All right. So this transformation in terms of especially financially availability, we made lots of videos also about banking, how these early modern armies were financed, and there is a rich historiography about this notoriously, because that's a bit the thing of the modernists. We can't start tracking them documentarily speaking, right? Which you can't do for most of the Middle Ages in a satisfactory way, so that modernists invented that there is a period in which those things did not exist before, and it's actually not the case. They always existed, just not to the degree they needed to formalize them or document them in the way you can also for certain specific realities of the 16th. I don't think that during the Renaissance also everything is documented. We can't study it so limpidly. There are certain areas of Europe that were already way more advanced than others during the modern era. That's the difference part that I was highlighting before, for saying that, again, we tend to see, again, this not existing, actually, this magical, this phantomatic boundary between the Middle Ages and the modern age that wasn't really a thing, even in strictly military terms, right? And in other videos we will explain further what I mean when I say that, in fact, the Middle Ages lasted really until the end of what we call the modern age in terms of probably the political, military, and social fundamentals of the entire system, right? But when we talk about the financial side of the story, which is one, we are also looking at the transformation driven by the methodical consolidation of the statal bureaucratic apparatuses and the consequently refined capacity for tax collection. I have an entire playlist dedicated to medieval government that mostly analyzes this, especially also for the later Middle Ages, because naturally that's increasingly the better documented part tendentially. And also because, as we've seen, this increasing political cohesion alongside essentially national patterns, etc. In France, that was at the beginning of the era the most statally advanced country in Europe, and also the greatest power, unsurprisingly. The permanent taille tax that we've seen, I made a video about this, how they had began to finance the bande d'ordonnance, the other semi-permanent units they had at their service, was formalized under Charles VII. Made lots of videos about his reign. And in Spain, the alcabala sales tax systematized under the Reyes Católicos Ferdinand and Isabella exemplified this fiscal evolution, generating unprecedented revenue streams. Right, even in Spain, where the actual monarchy was just a sum of crowns of, in fact, distinct kingdoms that remained so until like the later modern age. However, witness within the same this increasingly sophisticated tax collection that is also what you can appreciate behind the Spanish armies of the Italian wars, the Tercio, and more. Even though money also came from, ironically or unironically, the same. Initially, the Fugger for the Habsburgic Empire, then the Bank of St. George for the same in general. But it's with a greater cooperation, and at this point was not merely, of course, a regional one, right? Banking was really, since the 13th century, already a very sort of globally Western European system, intertwined and specifically also connected, as far as monarchies' interactions were concerned, with military spending, military funding, if anything, from the financiers' side, in exchange for, in fact, assets, monopolies, etc. That's also how the nobility, that increasingly backed the process, also power concentration at the top, helped developing the state as well. Now, these taxes were levied on an economy at this point, at least we're talking the Renaissance, experiencing tumultuous but still vigorous expansion, catalyzed significantly by, as you know, the influx of approximately 200 tons of gold and 18,000 tons of silver from the Americas between 1500 and 1600 alone, as recorded, by the way, in Spanish colonial ledgers. It's not a surprise, again, that the Spanish were at that point the strongest military in Europe. And this buoyant influx, primarily from famously the mines like Potosi, fueled monetary inflation and stimulated transatlantic trade, enriching royal treasuries further. The result was a dramatic surge in the scale of armies clashing on the battlefield, a shift from the small feudal hosts that would have been seen in certain particular contexts, also in the later centuries, essentially towards a larger, more structured force. As I just said, it's not quite true, again, that these armies were much larger than before. This was a gradual path, especially if you're really looking at the early Renaissance, and so the early, 16th century, that had its own crisis also within, which did not really help states to be more powerful in that regard. But gradually, again, remember the force of power compaction. Had you seen, again, the amount of troops mobilized in the 13th century all across Europe, regardless of states, you would see there how and why that system had been bigger. This is, after all, notorious. It's not until the 17th century that Europe recovers fully from the Black Death of 1348, that also demographically certain countries come back to the previous times. There are huge changes properly to the social fabric that are translated in these, yes, gradually larger armies in terms of especially individual political control on them. The formula, the composition was, by the way, the same of the one of later medieval hosts, right? Essentially, backbone of mercenaries, some, say, still feudal, mostly nobiliar forces, and militias, all right? This is what continues throughout all the early modern age, however, with some changes, like the first full national statal army is the one of Louis XIV, And even in that case, you know that the various regiments were actually subcontracted, so it's not like everything changed. Like you really have to await for Napoleon, the French Revolution, a bit certain things to really set the standards of an absolute state, where the army is fully just like homogeneously the army of a single nation and of nobody else. And we will talk, of course, about this stuff in other videos. We haven't really done, regardless of my Clausewitzian outlook, and say we never talked too much about his actual times, in part because they are so important in this regard for the channel that they require an enormous effort from my side to plan the videos very well, right? But what happens in the Renaissance is indeed the notion that the King of France now, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, etc., now really have an army that increasingly respond to him in a cohesive way. It's not easy. Think about Landsknechten after the first siege of Vienna that literally kidnapped the same city against their pay, you know, threatening to slaughter the Viennese just like the Turks would have done had the city had fallen. So again, it's a very imperfect moment. There isn't, in this sense, anything essentially different from what had happened in the previous centuries, if not the numbers of, say, the scale of this control, this more statically controlled core. This is really what it's the main feature. We've seen it also described in many different European national armies. What mostly this improvement takes the form of, right? At the 1525 siege of Pavia, the French army, bolstered by 6,000 Swiss pikemen, by the way, so not French subjects, and early arquebusiers trained in volley tactics, comprised 23,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, including heavy gendarmes, so literally the gendarmes. France is an interesting example because it highlights the non-obviousness of this composition. The French could feel that this army not just was defeated in the Battle of Pavia by the imperials and the Spanish, but they had not really developed to a greater extent properly the homogeneity of a national army, especially as far as pike and shot warfare was concerned. I made a video about probably the native French infantry of the Italian wars that was initially a very sort of small thing. It just gained steam towards the latter half of the 16th century to just, you know, fill the gap like that had been formed between, for this reason, the French and other armies, also likely bringing to the French defeat in the Italian wars, because if the French had hired actual nationals for their infantry, they would have likely overpowered the Spanish. Like the massive demographic and agricultural resources of France were incomparable. But they could have also triggered a revolution of disgruntled veterans belonging to the fourth estate, and you know that's also something that in France does tend to happen. It had already happened with the Jacquerie, not because they had armed the plebs just per se, but I mean. This would be seen. We have made a video about it also in the war, let's say the French War of Religion, so-called, and later with the Fronde, the French Revolution. And there were many other instances in which that could break out, and that's a good explanation. Nevertheless, they had enough money to hire all these people, including like the very strong cavalry and artillery park. The Swiss also were top-notch at the time. They competed with the Landsknechten. They really hated each other's guts. But in fact, the other side of the same Pavia is interesting because the Spanish force under the Marquis of Pescara, which decisively routed the French, numbered 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was a smaller army, however, it was better organized through the innovative tertio formation. I will talk more and better about that. Made a couple of videos about it so far. What was roughly like this 3,000 men pike and shot now unit that had integrated, in fact, arquebusiers, later musketeers with pikemen for mutual protection, right? Especially the Battle of Cerignola with, Gonzalo de Cordoba, Gran Capitan, was the foundation, we can argue, of modern warfare itself, right? This tactic would be refined during the rest of the Italian wars, 1494, 1559, and it had been, by the way, experimented exactly to cope with the otherwise very strong French army that had still some feudal features, you understand here, for example, in the organic, in the composition, regardless of the size of the army. So you can't quite make the simple equation, especially when between, say, wealth and sort of this update and uniformity. It does tendentially push towards that direction because there is just essentially a better way to do things, regardless of the background that also informs these armies. But it's not, again, quite the same thing. It's a slow change. And when you look at the size, again, 30, well, here we can also debate about the actual size of the armies at the Battle of Pavia. But when you understand like multiple, we're talking 20, 30,000 men, you're matching that with an extraordinarily large army that also mostly settled the matter in Italy, because there is going to be other expeditions, other campaigns in the peninsula, but more or less Pavia settles that. In fact, my first video about the Italian wars begins with, of course, Charles VIII's invasion and stops at Pavia. But we will talk also about the other also gruesome battles where you find these systems still sort of testing one another, mostly with smaller forces and with chronic shortage of pay, of money, right, which is a problem that eventually brings to the same sack of Rome by the side of what should have been the allies, like the imperials. And so it's complicated, and you understand also how disorderly it could be in practice. But the size is really impressive, and it does speak of forces that you could have found, again, ideally as the largest armies. By the way, in the same peninsula, because that's mostly where the largest armies in the Middle Ages were during the early 14th century. And we don't study these chapters enough separately and individually. And still, these were enormous sizes for the early 16th century. They wouldn't become habitual immediately all the way through. In fact, only importantly later on you would have armies that would surpass probably even by scale. Like you have to, for that, to await the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century. Even there was at some point some shrinking, even because of doctrinal issues of literally commanding the army in a completely different picture. What you can see, however, is that the troops fielded at Pavia in 1525 were monumental, really, compared to the ones of battles like Tewkesbury, that I also made a video on in Tactical Analysis. 1471, it's a battle of the Wars of the Roses, where forces rarely exceeded 6,000 men, typically comprising knights and hastily levied archers, not even cavalry most of the times, in that peculiar English war that, in fact, you should evaluate not much in terms of full size. We've made videos actually about Tudor armies showing how, in fact, it's not like the English ever fielded enormous amount of troops at that point, but it's also true, in fact, that Britain was a bit more isolated after the 100 Years' War from, instead of a much faster development in continental Europe. So it's maybe an unfair comparison. When you look again at France, Spain, Italy, etc., you realize that the size of armies had always been bigger, but for some reason we just don't study that, not during the Middle Ages or even the modern one, right? Even before the Sun King, etc. So it's a matter of, unfortunately, of national bias. You could argue, let's say, the way historiographies did not focus more than much on the military history of foreign countries, depending on eventually how widespread this would become, also thanks to the same, or in spite of the same publications. A parallel increase occurred in the number of soldiers maintained on state payrolls, made multiple videos specifically on this economics, salarial, administrative aspect for especially 15th century French, and again, Italian, Spanish armies. Properly during peacetime, to garrison an expanding array of fortresses increasingly constructed according to the trace italienne design, by the way. This encapsulates two dynamics. The first one is that, as we've seen, most of those half or fully paid companies that basically had been the core of, you can argue any army in history, but let's say had properly been contractually and organically outlined in the sources since the 13th century, especially as the backbone of the mercenary professional troops that were often one of the same subjects, by the way. So by noblemen that were at the same time like running this business but being bound by say to loyalty towards their own kingdoms. And in fact, that's also how the later subcontracting of the regiments would basically reflow towards that national nobility, regardless of, for example, the increasingly foreign origin of the troops in certain circumstances. But it had occurred really in times of semi-permanent warfare, or of permanent one, depending on literally how you would pay these guys. During the 100 Years' War, in particular, during the great great as mostly unsuccessful military exploit of the Burgundian state. The same Italian wars, and also like before that, also in the peninsula through the condottas that were more or less always mobilizing and being all around for the whole year, right, as military available. So it's really another rhythm of warfare that would deserve not much this sort of almost bookkeeping kind of research, but say a more integrated sort of political, institutional, and military historical studies to fully picture, especially in a wholly Western European dimension. And looking at that also, what kind of systems were basically at the same level of development, regardless of the fact that they had come from different backgrounds, and still, of course, were important. The other dynamic is, of course, the one of the trace italienne that corresponds to essentially the development of armed forces on the fortificatory side of the story. I made a very early video on the trace italienne that we will come back on. I also made a video about Vauban. When you look at early modern siegecraft, you realize that in fact there was a continuous updating, right, innovation effort to counter especially artillery development, etc. But it's also a relatively gradual phenomenon. All right, and so think about how encapsulated Europe was during the Middle Ages. At this point, it happens exactly what I was saying before for politically with the armies. It's not like you have necessarily more fortifications in the early modern age. You have better individual fortifications, are much more technical, much more professional, and that are controlled especially by the local state, as opposed to some private lord, right? It could happen in the Middle Ages. Also in here, let's be concrete about what happened in this, not much evolution, but if you want, redistribution of power, and surely some improvement also during the, say, throughout the whole civilizational history. After all this system had been working on trying to improve, and so regardless of the ups and downs with the Black Death and the demographic collapse, etc., things tended still to salvage what had been functionally providing with more power later. Speaking of the trace italienne, that even just by a name condenses the French and Italian sort of dominance in, say, military affairs, military technology, especially for the latter, right? Was pioneered, in fact, in the Italian peninsula by Italian powers before they were in part taken over during the Italian wars. And and it in fact witnessed an important acceleration after the same 1494 French invasion of the peninsula. As you know, the trace italienne, so the Italian trace, featured low, thick walls, angled bastions, and outworks like Ravelin to resist the devastating impact of siege artillery. Right, you essentially try to avoid any sort of frontal, perpendicular, exposure to the artillery trajectory. You lower your profile literally to be less hit. And we find the trace italienne spreading essentially as the most updated military fortification style throughout, in fact, the most advanced parts of Europe, really. Encapsulation had been pioneered exactly, again, by the Italians, by the French throughout the Middle Ages as well. In fact, we find splendid examples of this in a very strategic and sort of turbulent area, almost a frontier for the French, like Occitania, that was, threatened by the Bourbon Rebellion, the Ottoman excursions, so to say, in localities like Sals, in Roussillon, and also there were the Spanish from that the southwestern side, right? So that's interesting as a broader picture, where also these fortifications were scientifically located and built with royal funds, right, to have an ever more sort of broadly strategic sense of how to employ these fortifications. Again, not a radical change as we've been used to think, but definitely a pretty important visual one. I mean, generationally speaking, it would have been well perceived. This expands that, by the way, like for fortifications, you can't even say to have been particularly greater in proportion than the one of late medieval budgets, once you understand that fortifications, again, were, generally speaking, more widespread, being less. And so the monarchy, to some extent, in order to come to rule over different centers and with their defenses, etc., did not necessarily need to simply invest in its construction. It had always happened. It's not a surprise that the most concentrated monarchic powers like France, England, Sicily, etc., had been, in fact, more specialized in this and had created some of the best military architectures of the High Middle Ages. But in fact, this is also the point, like fortifications alone are just stones, all right? And so you must have an actual will, an actual purpose, like to just join politically and thus militarily when needed to eventually take over enemy settlements and to build also other fortifications. That's how it gradually had happened, and that had always been quite costly, right? It's just that now the burden becomes relatively increasingly onerous for the state. Also, a bit technically speaking, for the same reasons. The high cost of masonry, according to the different technological eras we're discussing, the need for specialized engineers, all things that you could see very well. We made multiple videos about this in the Middle Ages. You can see the greater political concentration, though. For example, the arsenal of Venice, that is the largest one in the world at that point, the most specialized, most technical, is something that remains up to the 18th century the most advanced and a bit like a model for the same rest of Europe. Even Peter the Great was to come to Venice, preferring that to the Dutch still in the early 18th century, right? Foretelling how also enduring this and how advanced even this systems already were from the end of the Middle Ages, not necessarily just owing to modernity, to the later modernity, their greatness. The growing strategic importance of such strongholds, which could anchor entire regions at a point, and only, however, by supporting armies, because otherwise alone they would have been useless, will be elaborated in other videos, because there is, as you know, a very specific technicality to that. I have siege warfare playlist. I will build something myself, maybe something about fortifications in particular, to get ever more technical about it, because you find there unavoidably just fortifications compared also to artillery. As it's obvious, you can't really study one without the other. Emperor Charles V, whose empire spanned the Habsburg domains and drew on American bullion through the Spanish possessions, estimated to contribute 2.5 million ducats annually by 1540, or roughly, essentially 40% of its revenue, maintaining approximately 150,000 men by the mid-16th century, the vast majority stationed in garrisons across Italy, the Low Countries, and the German states. This gives you a dimension also of the general costs, like 2.5 millions ducats may seem like, as they were indeed, enormous, but if you look at, I don't know, medieval sieges such as the one of, for example, of Milan by Bertrand de Puget in the 20s of the 14th century, or the Venetian siege of Zara in the 40s, we're talking about 1.1 million ducats at the time. So we're talking in medieval times, just the papacy and Venice being able to make like half of what the Habsburgic Empire at the peak of its power really could. And this also with the American precious metals. So just to make you understand how there isn't really this major takeoff. It's easy. That's the trick that modernists use to do this post 1348, right, with the crisis and everything. And so it seems as if from the mid 14th century, like compared to the second half of the century or the 15th, oh my God, 16th century armies were immense. But actually, it wasn't too much the case. Indeed, 150,000 men is a lot, right? And these are just sort of upkeeping, pace. So it's something that tendentially did not happen, for example, in those earlier medieval times, etc. Also, these are, we could say, already proto-regimental forces. Mostly they are the tercios, by the way, and the Landsknechten, right? We're talking Charles V here. Without mentioning that again, the territorial expanse here is pretty big, right? We all know how large the Charles V's empire really was, stretching over multiple continents all across the globe. What is important here is that how regularized such expenses become, right? Even though, again, here we're talking about an Habsburgic Empire that does not mean that it was ever a single empire whatsoever. This was, again, the Holy Roman Empire, as far as, by the way, just what the Habsburgs controlled as emperors, that, however, privately meant less than that. Here it's during the Reformation, half of the country was not reachable in some ways. In Spain, so much the entirety of Spain with the Italian dependencies. And so literally the single states, say, I don't know, Naples or Milan would have provided what these states would have always provided as individual ones, plus the Americas. So it's again a pretty spread out force as well that does not even respond to the same actual rulers, because it's not like the Spanish rulers, say, and subjects answer to the Holy Roman Emperor, right? They were two distinct parallel parts. They happened to be the same person in Charles V. But as you know, also his brother controlled more like the Austrian part of the story, is in autonomy, etc. So it's not a unified state, of course, that is able to do that. But comparatively, it's interesting, of course, to assess. Now, about the same, such forces comprising, as we were just saying, like the Spanish tercios, the German Landsknecht, picturesquely, aside from the more humble fighting rank pikemen, say armed with Zweiender, for example, and the Italian condottieri as well, the quite rich seigneuries of the peninsula, operated, as we just said, under a decentralized command structure, right? They were all behaving as belonging to their own respective states. You had, however, certain figures that play, especially this was even in the Spanish side, that was actually more advanced than, in fact, the imperial one. Some figures like Captain Antonio de Leiva overseeing regional contingents, which meaning that there were some military, say, leaders, some certain commanders that worked as military observers regarding the fitness of the single regional forces for the sake of what was also, think about, in fact, the era of the Italian wars, de facto continuous clash, sometimes intermittently in different parts of Europe, but still. This system, while effective for occupation, by the way, bore no resemblance to the disciplined standing armies later developed by figures like Gustavus Adolphus or Louis XIII. Right? Even though these were even before the big step of the Sun King, we will look at them later, and definitely we're going toward that mid 17th century when things really start to take off. Those were the prodrome, right? In one of the main differences was that those later forces relied on a much more statally controlled recruitment and training system that at this point was, instead in the early 16th century, was still rudimentary. Governments were thus now, even just from a this is not just the psyche of a government, there's no such thing, but they were just habituated now to, and compelled really more than else, to allocate permanent, substantial military expenditures in their budgets, right? It's mostly it's not like before they hadn't always had to spend an enormity for war. This was true since every age. It's always the same at the same time. But now they have to do it in ways that manage to organize this more stably. And in part, this actually derives from a collapse of the average person. And again, in the history of civilization, the individual becomes ever weaker. And we talked about this in the videos, for example, explaining how modern discipline owes much to also Protestant theology, how really the man is conceived in all this, in the fact that for even bigger shatterings, people are ever less capable, and you need this central authority taking care of most of the organizational issues, which entails massive sort of moral, anthropological, cultural changes. We shouldn't be fooled just by what, again, an accounting perspective is. That is the stark, I would notice, the stark departure from the negligible peacetime costs of the immediate or past, when, I don't know, yet another English example, monarchs like Edward IV relied on ad hoc levies disbanded after campaigns, right? This technically was still like that, because you would have this core of permanent forces that were, however, the minority of the entire state forces, and the ones that would actually be fielded, right? Aside from the fact that there were lots of mercenaries, also these were at times more reliable, and the whole size of the armies, putting them together, would shrink due to desertion, attrition, illnesses, etc. So it was a necessity not to literally remain without any backbone of military force during campaigns. So it's much more tragic and sort of patchworked than we may conceive. Much less glorious and epic and whatever. Most things actually go down in history. But surely also building a great deal of, let's say, a new way of considering loyalty, duty. I made a video specifically on this topic, how the set of moral values change accordingly, also in the military, right? For example, in the beginning of the era, a soldier like a Landsknecht could be considered as a as a proto-aristocrat, bearing arms, having that right within the empire as an estate on its own, represented in front of the emperor, while later modern soldiers were basically just mere scum of the earth, press ganged into regiments, into ships. Like it's a completely different thing. Now, following the remarkable expansion of army sizes in the early 16th century, military forces, however, again ceased to grow further. Right, there is an actual mini crisis as well. Actually, it's a massive crisis, but in the mid-16th century, that freezes things a little, to say the least, given that the scale of armies, as we've seen them now, it's as if they had retopped in part what, as we've seen in the highest point of the Middle Ages, could be afforded. But they remained largely unchanged even during the 30 Years' War, right? That, as you know, was fought between 1618 and 1648. The clash that devastated Central Europe mostly, and that reduced populations by up to 40% in some German regions. But you see, even on that occasion, for example, even comparatively across Europe, it's not like too much had changed. The Swedes start having, for example, a solid military, mostly because the French pay for it. And with that money, there is also an improvement in Sweden. In fact, the way the troops were recruited, which was a bit unthinkable before. We will talk about the early Vasa period, as a matter of fact, in Swedish warfare, because it's very, very interesting. A renaissance of Swedish warfare, say before Gustavus Adolphus in particular, because it's much more primitive and brutal, and it tells you how sort of medieval, if anything, it had remained, regardless of the fact that you had gunpowder, firearms around, and its technology is not the cause, the root cause especially. If anything, it's just a symptom of certain development across civilization, but not really, it doesn't tell you much about the actual levels of statal development. In fact, the largest armies in Europe remain concentrated fundamentally in the south, right? In the west, in the south mostly. At the decisive Battle of Rocroi in 1643, the French army led by the Duc d'Enghien, later Prince of Condé, deployed 24,000 men, which is not too much, right? It's true that, again, the 30 Years' War was still being fought, basically. I made a video about the same Condé, or at least I made a video about the commanders of the 30 Years' War, starting exactly with the Duc d'Enghien, where we tell also repeatedly how many troops, let's say a few tens of thousands of men have become basically the norm to wage, like even in some cases, a provincial warfare, especially we're talking Western Europe, because in Central, Eastern Europe, things get a bit more rarefied, right? But as you understand, these are not dramatically larger numbers compared to earlier times. You can argue that it was a bit more about artillery, that was a bit more costly in that sense. But, is this also this enormous radical improvement, like numerically wise, I'm talking just numerically, compared to, again, some periods in the peak of medieval times? Not really. And this is just something you're not going to be told, right? If you visit other YouTube channels, the broader narrative is that basically medieval armies were small, even the bigger 100 Years' War battles, as if warfare actually stopped just to the 100 Years' War, were small, like again, Azincourt, a few, like, say just 10,000, things like that. Remember, there is a lot, like we know these things well, right? Many other YouTube channels do not know that, but I can assure you that historiographically we know these things very, very, very well. What we can appreciate, of course, of mid-17th century armies were sophisticated combined arms, approaches, integrating cavalry wings, masked armed infantry in tendentially linear formations, 12-pound field guns for mobility, as well. So all things that would eventually head towards linear tactics that also took. It's not like the 18th century started and linear tactics were fully there, right? It's not before actually the second half of the 18th century with the 7 Years' War that linear tactics are fully developed in the way we intend them, right? I made a video specifically about this. It was a very gradual process. So if it was gradual in the 18th century, you can imagine how gradual it was also in the previous ones. At Rocroi, the French of Danguin faced 17,000 Spaniards, so even less. Spaniards, whose tercios, once invincible, were outmaneuvered due to their rigidity against French cavalry charges, led by Jean de Gassion, and artillery barrages that disrupted pike squares. It's also not so like the radical end of the tercio or an entire way of war, but it was definitely like an important, prepotent step forward towards some kind of also coming back, for example, of cavalry. Like the French as a feudal state still until Louis XIV would have, regardless of their power concentration, as we were saying before, would keep making use of French cavalry. I personally was very impressed in the video about the Battle of Freiburg, one of the last major ones of the 30 Years' War, how sturdy and courageous French infantry already was by that time, right? Just to show, as a matter of fact, so things change. They definitely head towards specific directions, but they're not so rapid as we think. In fact, we're rather looking at some sort of, not of stagnation. You can argue that, for example, the peak of, the greatest shrinking of cavalry on the battlefields was the mid-16th century already. By the end of it, it was understood that cavalry charges, way before Gustavus Adolphus, were regaining relevance. Just the pike, of course, was a bit more solid than it would be later. So there is the sense of apparent stagnation, also due to, again, severe crises, forever wars. Think about the Dutch rebellion. In fact, the 80 Years' War, as it's called. Major periods of just recovery. Italy, after the Italian wars, fortunately had like almost 150 years of peace. France was engulfed for a long time in the aforementioned confessional clashes. All this in moments in which, by the way, like threats were a bit everywhere, and they were eroding great part of also the available military resources. So indeed, this stagnation in army sizes itself was partly a consequence of this, at times economic, also demographic crisis, the Malthusian cycles of a bit too deterministic historical motivation. We think, for example, the price revolution exacerbating this. These are very important, of course, financial issues occurring because of the same injection of too much precious metals. It wasn't even necessarily simply equating, as you know, to a specific expendability, right? And this was a problem for the same Spanish Empire. In fact, grain prices in Castile itself rose sevenfold between 1500 and 1600, crippling purchasing power and inflating the same military costs. And Castile was the beating heart of Spain. Financial constraints became an unavoidable limit when Philip II's Spanish administration began planning the invasion of England in the 80s of the 16th century. I made a video specifically about this planning. Strategists, including the Marquis of Santa Cruz, calculated that an optimal force would require 556 ships comprising galleons, galleasses, and zabras, carrying 30,000 sailors and 65,000 soldiers at a cost equivalent to 4 years of American bullion revenue, that were being especially targeted in the cargo shippings by the English in the same moment to delay the same invasion of England, interestingly enough. We're talking something like 9 million ducats, right? So enormous expenses that really needed that much time just to accumulate the money to pay for. This was, in fact, utterly unfeasible given Spain's chronic deficits and reliance on Genoese bankers, as we were saying before. The Spanish Armada that sailed in 1588 under the Duke of Medina Sidonia mustered only 128 ships, equipped with just 243 heavy cannon. In fact, far fewer than the English fleet's 497. As you understand, this is not much a doctrinal problem. It's literally like the Spanish couldn't put more together because they had already staffed their ships, by the way, in an incredible way. They even started from the same Spain as opposed to doing the whole thing from the Netherlands, for example. They carried roughly 10,000 sailors and 20,000 soldiers, less than a third of the projected optimum. They would have been capable of, if landed in Britain, to overrun English forces. So in that sense, you see, in war, there is always the good enough for which it's worth really the gamble. It was either at that point or never. The Armada's failure, however, was compounded by its reliance on unwieldy galleons vulnerable to English fireships and the faster culverin armed race-built galleons of Francis Drake and John Hawkins, that in that sense were propelling English naval power, as we've seen in other videos, towards heights of quality that the Spanish, as we've seen just from a structural point of view, could probably not afford in that moment, right? So it's always, they were balancing each other out. Both sides were desperate given what was at stake. And as you understand, the odds were always, like in the major encounters, the major clashes, pretty balanced after all. Consider, however, that the costs of the Armada, also for the same defense of England, were very much extreme at so many different levels, because they really absorbed an enormous series of community effort. Like the Spanish got ships from everywhere, from Naples, from Portugal. The English had to intensely try to stall the Spanish efforts by, again, ravaging their American holdings, and this required further funding for the same English ships. And it's not like Elizabeth I had all the money to spend, especially like the country itself most, because monarchs would actually contribute, like as she did from her own purse, right, giving trust, right, to her sea rogues. But the countries were incredibly resistant. It's just like what we've seen in medieval times. Estates did not really want to pay, right? Also because this military resources would end up, just the way they were handled, reinforcing, of course, the power of the monarchy itself in the process. But here we're talking risking, like literally annihilation, especially from the English side. Also, the Spanish defeat definitely did not help the country at all. And all this during the Dutch rebellion. So it's an incredibly complicated scenario in the counter-reformistic period. You can argue that in relative terms, every country was pressured to a degree that seemed grandiose, right? Doomed by overambition and logistical failures that had very important consequences in some provincial realities that maybe we don't consider, but that surely ended up being important in the bigger picture. In the case of the Armada, there was an inability to coordinate, for example, with the Spanish army in the Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, that also had said, look, give me some flat-bottom ships, we can't simply cross the channel and invade England just like that. And that had also said, look, this is not going to go well, right? And that Alexander Farnese was just one of the greatest commanders of the years. The insight was priceless. But also in that case is what do you really do, right? How can you really predict how it's going to go, right? It's mostly how much of a risk you want to take, because also the reward may be enormous. When pursuing more realistic objectives, at least objectives that were sort of more predictably, like, not spilling over broader theater, absolute monarchies generally succeeded in deploying the necessary forces, extracting an increasing share of their subjects' wealth as well. Anyway, by the 90s of the 16th century, military expenditure consumed, for example, something like 80% of state budgets in countries like Spain and France, that were naturally big powers. In resorting to loans, debasement of coinage, or bankruptcy, as Spain did multiple times, in 1557, 1575, and in 1596 to finance wars. All the balance behind this, like probably for the durability of the system, was incredibly precarious. At the end of the day, these states managed to pull it off in a broader civilizational sense. I mean, as I was saying before, humans tend to improve things when, especially under pressure, they realize what's really the right thing to do. However, there is also an enormous level of resistance, right? So certain states did not make it. Central European elective monarchies were knocked out historically in this period. Think about Hungary, or later Poland, or even just, the Bohemians, for what they had done in the 15th century. Just all by themselves, by the way, self-destruction. Think about the Burgundian states, right? Literally at that point, the French didn't have to do anything. Charles the Bold really self-destroyed, so he sank the ship all by himself against the Swiss iceberg, admittedly, but by his own volition. So this period witnesses an important deal of contracting measures. For example, in Spain, the use of letras de cambio, so bills of exchange. This stuff existed since the 13th to the 14th century as a sort of widespread measure in Western European banking. You can check those videos I made about Italian banking in particular that ended up financing both Spain and France during this period. The merchants of Lyon were, as a matter of fact, all Italians. The Bank of St. George, as we've seen, substituted the German Fuggers as the latter went bankrupt to support the Habsburgs themselves. You have again the asientos, that is loan contracts as well, with bankers like the Fuggers we just mentioned becoming critical to sustaining these efforts, because without them really there weren't other easier, smoother ways to get lots of money that still had to be compensated in a way or another. But more than else, also in this case, it was about having a steady flow of money. Then you could simply contract debt and or repaying with, as we've seen, monopolies, certain landed assets, whatever. But money was so critical at so many different levels, because entire armies could and would mutiny, right? Think about the sack of Antwerp, think about the aforementioned Landsknecht and the same sack of Rome, right? So these things happened in great part also because the same commanders from the field could not control troops that simply wanted to loot if they hadn't been properly paid, which was like a very frequent eventuality, to say the least. More than financial barriers, it was bureaucratic inefficiencies, or let's say asphyxia, together with logical deficiencies, also problems of distances, communication, etc., that constrained armies, right? Think about how important the Spanish road was from Flanders to Italy. In general, ensuring, right, specific political loyalty, controlling one pass, having enough supplies at one point, etc., was so really important in a strategy that became ever more pan-European. But all this was equated to battle against certain limits that often prevented armies from surpassing a certain operational threshold, right? And literally dividing, in this sense, also different spaces in Europe. As we said before, largely, for example, Central and Eastern Europe remained also not really theaters of major interest for other European powers, unless we're talking, I don't know, it depends. The Ottomans had an interest, for example, in Eastern Europe, but also because they had a fringe where they operated in similar patterns to the way those countries did as well. But it's obvious that, say, Italy, Flanders, these had been the main battlefields, eventually Germany in the 17th century. All of Europe, telling the truth, wherever there is wealth and interest and, envy and sort of an opportunity to overthrow, like, the status quo, like, goes through such things. While additional troops could theoretically be recruited at any point, because it's not like at some point, we can't recruit anyone, nobody can join. There were ways to do so. But what kind of troops were they, right? Sustaining them with regular provisions and wages, in fact, would become nearly impossible when resources were outstretched, given especially the reliance on foraging, local requisitions, and unreliable supply convoys vulnerable to ambushes. And at that point, by the way, hiring mercenary brokers like Ernst von Mansfeld often ended up essentially entrusting these logistical matters to people that were definitely more efficient in handling them, but still essentially preying over the population. At some point could even be friendly rather than enemy, and at some point, like, not really caring necessarily for even the image of the monarchy, for that matter. Campaign hardships, diseases like typhus and dysentery. We were looking at this, for example, in that video about Canadian warfare in the late 17th, early 18th century, which could decimate up to 1/3 of an army within a matter of weeks, as well as desertions, rapidly reduced ranks. Made entire videos explaining how even organic development throughout this era, which starts becoming also very modern, right? You have companies, regiments, brigades, etc., actually occurred through mostly the adaptation to these deficiencies that and sort of practical adaptability, like during the campaign, rather than any positively thought out, okay, so now we will organize the army like that, ideally, and we will go by that in the centuries. That's not how it happened, right? In the summer of 1632, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, whose military reforms included standardized musket calibers, and again, it's not even fully true in the sense that it's from there on that simply like all Swedish armies would have, 17 millimeters for infantry. That's not really how it happened. But say, lightweight 4-pound regimental guns. We will talk about the Swedish army in Gustavus Adolphus' innovation, because most of it is anecdotal, really. It's mostly just like the practice that favored a greater homogenization and professionalization, and just the army tending towards an optimum that was decided by same troops, by the same officers at some point, like whether, the pike had to be preferably abandoned at certain points, marching across Germany, relying more on firepower, having to cope with specific enemies. And it's not like the Swedish army was so overbearingly advanced compared to the bigger Catholic ones, by the way. That's also a bit of a misconception. Made multiple videos on this. But what really happened in the Swedish army that is so crucial, hinting at it before, is that salaried troops were mostly enrolled with satisfactory performance next to the mercenaries. There is this notion that now, like, a country like Sweden paradoxically was advantaged by this, by the fact that it did not really have much bureaucracy in between. They had remained so relatively underdeveloped up to that point that when the French money came, they modernized in a much more supervised fashion. It's like, it sounds bad to say in a way, but as a comparison, if anything, but there are very poor countries, for example, in the 20th century, we witnessed this in the 21st. When you really have nothing, it's easier to update to the newest thing, right? If you have the funds, right? This is exactly how it happened. So eventually, like just in a matter of few decades, Louis XIV would do the same on a much bigger scale with France, that would become indeed the tendentially hegemonic continental power, had by far the strongest army again, and a very old tradition, as we already highlighted here, that we tend a bit to downplay. We'll explain at some point a bit what kind of historiographical tricks at certain point happen concerning like national military reputations. But let's say that Gustavus Adolphus could finally command, for example, a field army of 45,000 men in Germany. Admittedly, that was basically it, right? It was such a punching force, also thanks to its tactical, say, synergy, due mostly to direct experience gain on the field, that was the entire punch entering up to Bavaria and causing havoc, to say the least, among the Catholics, that, however, sort of coped with it and were able to, at the end of the day, to push it back in a way or another. 45,000 men is really considerable. It's one of the largest used in Europe since the Roman legions under Trajan. We should also actually try to differentiate between what was actually fully used on the battlefield and what could be reserves, detachments. At times there were also multiple armies operating separately, so it's not necessarily the thing. But it's also about the capacity of putting different elements together, making them work. For example, there were some Polish-style winged hussars and Scottish musketeers. These are the exotical extremes, telling the truth, in that same Swedish force, reflecting how, say, even these armies were, in fact, like the contingental sum of many different elements. The core, however, was really the most important aspect, and also the most difficult to handle. For example, logistically speaking, provisioning such a mass, larger than the population of contemporary Augsburg, where they passed, by the way, in Bavaria, we're talking approximately 45,000. The town itself exceeded the same Gustavus Adolphus logistical capacity. Reliant still on ox-drawn wagons and the war-ravaged resources of Franconia and Bavaria, which they had themselves sucked dry. By the Battle of Lützen on November 16, 1632, where Gustavus Adolphus' brigade system with 6 to 8 ranks of musketeers alternating fire clashed with Wallenstein's Caracol cavalry and 20,000 strong imperial army, only 18,000 men remained under his command, a loss exacerbated by guerrilla attacks by Croat light cavalry used by the Catholics as well. And you always find in this sense these fundamentals in war, like, yes, you can have the big, strong army, and then you're going to pay for it, all right? You're going to have a cost that is, of course, not just military, it's primarily, again, political and social, invested in a military theater that is, of course, going to adapt according to the circumstances. And so it's not much just about the Croat light cavalry was habituated to some kind of steppe warfare against the Ottomans, the Hungarians, that made simply they talk about these guys in videos about the German Catholic say uniforms, so to say, military dress, including, in fact, the ones used by also by these non-German troops, specifically by the imperials we meant there, but by the fact that such enormous army was too big just to hope that it would remain intact during the campaign. And by the way, nobody actually hoped that, if anything, such a large force was assembled exactly because it was understood that a big war was ahead and that you had to push through enemy territory, and this would require losses. So by the time, if you had been lucky, as Gustavus was also on top of its skill, of his skill to break through Catholic Germany, still you needed still manpower by that point, and the army would be predictably smaller, but you still needed this bulk of troops that remains fundamentally intact. However, at the end of the day, under an increasing pressure from the Catholic side, that the more they withdrew, the more they fought at home and could prepare a counterattack in the same theater, aside from Wallenstein's strategy to sever also, and that's also what played a role, the Protestant logistical lines from the Baltic, right, starting from Bohemia, so well behind the Swedes latitudinally speaking, as they would march also through there at some point. In any case, still we're talking Lützen. Again, we can argue about the sources. We'll surely make a video about that battle. But again, still 18,000, 20,000 men. It's not this enormous amount of troops, even compared to medieval times. These numbers, as we were saying before, with the example of Charles V and the Habsburgic Empire, were, however, floating on top of some sort of security measure / reserve / mortgage of some sort. That were the 183,000 soldiers maintained, according to you, by whom? Maintained, and irregularly so, paid by the Protestant coalition, to which, of course, Sweden participated, including the forces under Christian IV of Denmark, that had been also a former enemy of the same Gustavus Adolphus, and the Margrave of Baden-Durlach, with most troops stationed in garrisons, like Magdeburg, that at some point had been sacked, and or in fact dispersed mostly across regional fronts, increasingly equipped with early flintlock muskets and petronels for cavalry skirmishes, but still in fact not a fully cohesively drilled and available force. 183,000, if you add to the sparsity of it, to the fact that they depended on, as we've seen, different princes in Central and Northern Europe, the fact that, yes, this was a Protestant coalition, but that in fact these, like the King of Sweden and the King of Denmark, had been at war even against one another, and they were not really finished with that. They just had bigger problems. In hindsight, Christian IV of Denmark efforts paved the way for Gustavus Adolphus. Like the Danish basically held the Catholic off, not achieving really much in tactical terms, but strategically, like absorbing lots of forces in time for the French and the Swedes to organize the invasion of Germany. And so all a mechanism that, in fact, just by numbers wouldn't betray the more relative availability of the same forces. So if you rarefy that a bit, and you consider how some of these forces were not even properly paid, and some of them would have been just local militias at some point, you realize that those 18,000 at Lützen are kind of the real sort of, what those forces narrowed down. I mean, those 18,000 existed because those soldiers had existed, but they could have not been but that, right? More or less, give or take. So this was a form of safety. Right, because if you lost a major battle, at least you still had fortifications to entrench yourself in and preventing a major collapse of this state or another. At the same time, however, especially episodes like the Swedish phase of the 30 Years' War proved that armies were ever more capable of punching through even a significantly encastellated territory, like Germany could be. Also defended by the strongest German force, that was of course the Habsburgic one of its allies, etc. And that, therefore, of course, you couldn't simply rely on a attendistic and defensivistic mentality and attitude. It is really detrimental to concede the initiative to the enemy. And so it doesn't make much sense, as if all that money had been substantially misallocated, at least had been substantially diverted from the more important objective of the overall strategy. But a strategy, as von Clausewitz tells us, is the property of, like, say, state decision with a clear political mandate. A coalition of quarreling Protestant powers that are also very often backwards, especially the German Protestant states are very also backward. They're still feudally organized military-wise. There is even the northern monarchies have just limited options up to this point. But the profound disparity between the total troops burdening state budgets and those forming effective field armies partly reflected the era's expanded strategic horizons at the same time, because all those soldiers were still not simply necessary for just a more provincial purpose, right? They were part of bigger, as we've seen, European coalitions, enabling simultaneous operations across multiple theaters, such as in this case the Palatinate, Bohemia, the Netherlands, to pursue grand objectives. For Gustavus Adolphus, this was the audacious goal of dismantling the Habsburgic Catholic Empire, a vision articulated famously in his 1630 manifesto to the German princes themselves. So it's evident that there was a pretty strict concert, so to say, between this and that power, that regardless of rivalries, etc., were still fighting what appeared to be the same war, and that in fact would be quite a problem for the same Catholics in Germany as in the rest of Europe, because this war engulfed the whole freaking continent. More fundamentally, warfare's inherent inefficiency defined the 16th and the 17th centuries just in function of the later models, right? If you contrast it starkly, for example, to Napoleon's later campaign, which concentrated 100,000 men for decisive clashes like Austerlitz, that I also made an entire series on about the entire, probably all the various passages of the War of Third Coalition with Ulm, etc., 1805, obviously will be sort of jarring. However, we should point out, as we were hinting at before, that, for example, armies of hundreds of thousands of men were actually fielded not by Napoleon for the first time, but by the same French and all the allies that had coalesced against them during the War of Spanish Succession. That is just, well, it's a couple of generations after the 30 Years' War, but I mean, it's not that immediately distant. In fact, as I was saying at the very beginning of the video, the second half of the 17th century is the actual taking off moment, especially as far as army sizes, but obviously enough just of the capacity of organizing them to a certain level of qualitative capacity. It also forces, with a hard ways, like other countries that would have not done it otherwise, to literally safeguard their own existence. I mean, think about the Dutch army between the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. That's, in terms of cost benefits, like from a sheer economical point of view, the strongest army in history, at least the most efficient one. Why? Because they were a midget fighting against a giant on top, like just next to him, right? And of course, like, it took other powers like Austria, England, etc., to join the fray just to make the Netherlands hold, right? But there are so many examples of this. This back and forth, this up and down, is very important, right? You understand that there are levelings in the way powers rise or maintain their capacity, etc. And it's not, nothing is to be given for granted. It's just like an enormous effort coming very often too little, too late, but in equal ways, especially from the offender side, actually in ways that, as you know, are unfavorable to the offensive. And so that even though own, in fact, in the latter, the positive aim, like have also like the weaker grab on the whole situation because of the intrinsic advantage of defense, that however is not per se just decisive or the only thing that you have to pursue, because if you just pursue defense, you don't go anywhere. At least you should contemplate counteroffensive, so reaping the fruits of that defensive posture that is just per se not leading you anywhere you want to be. So this was all a slow attritional struggle aimed at exhausting adversaries through sieges and skirmishes, render it exorbitantly costly. There was a Spanish noble, it may have been Don Alvaro de Bazan, who lamented in 1630, quote, "A form of commerce where the one with the deepest coffers triumphs." It's just like Montecuccoli in Austria saying to the emperor, like, "Your Majesty, like, we need money, money, money. We've only one thing, money, money, money." Yeah, pecunia nervus belli, the Latin said. It's not all of that, because again, you don't have to fall into the trap of thinking that the richest wins. That's not, I mean, tendentially the most powerful is also the richer, yes, but does it always win? Ask Goliath, right? And the many sort of also less developed countries at some point, probably the weaker countries at some point actually managed to defeat more powerful ones. There's nothing deterministic about it. There are tendencies, but everything, like in the moment it is fought, has a specific logic that can make things tilt towards different directions, as long as the combat is still sustainable, right, for whichever political purpose you have set to achieve through that strategic mean. And obviously, when you look, for example, at the same Alvaro de Bazan's times, so the first half of the 17th century, look at the Castilian Cortes, so the Castilian Parliament, the estates, and you realize that there were, regardless of the might of Spain, there was still the greatest military power out there, were heavily, debating over war funding. It was always an enormous expense, and so something that even these estates were willing to pay only up to a certain point. The causes extend beyond scarce resources, limited manpower, or ponderous bureaucracies, though these were significant, with Spain's Council of War, Consejo de Guerra, often delaying decisions by months. A more critical factor warranting separate analysis was the paramount role of fortifications and sieges in military strategy. We hinted at it before: the proliferation of artillery-resistant fortresses, such as the 1622-1626 siege of Bergen op Zoom, which required 60,000 pounds of gunpowder and 12,000 cannonballs, anchored armies to static fronts, dictating prolonged campaigns and drastically slowing operational tempos, as siege trains of 50-plus guns became standard by the 30s of the 17th century. But does it really remind you anything? You have essentially bigger powers, but is this particularly different from the Middle Ages? All medieval warfare was blocked by castles. How easy it was to stop armies. What about this kind of firepower, still in the first half of the 17th century? There's really a lot. It's not a few or something that simply comes with few resources, maybe just a random army was passing by and was stopped by some defenses. No, this required like the full cost of an entire campaign, of an enormous amount of logistical effort and beyond, right? So this is really an important aspect of the wall, and it's not to be given for granted either when you compare the Middle Ages with other eras, as a matter of fact. In any case, you will probably find this information scattered all across my channel. We talk, as a matter of fact, very often about this stuff because it is, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, something that requires actually a certain dedication, something that considers let's say, an approach that goes beyond whatever hearsay you're habituated at times to receive, to absorb, to chew, right? And this seems to me incredibly relevant in a world that does not seem to care about this anymore. It's not even like the information sometimes is wrong, all right? It is that nobody really would even think to speak about this stuff, which seems to me instead the single most relevant one in the light of just what we discuss every day, which seems like a vicious circle, but it is actually the, as I was saying before, like the full measure of our really of our analysis and what we more generally discuss in Schwerpunkt, right? So this aspect is, in my opinion, probably again the most important we can draw, the one that, in my opinion, can help understanding better also so much of what happens in this time and all its ramifications, right? So life is strange, and so war is strange, by the way, and it's never straightforward to simply tell history in ways that can really be meaningful and attractive. People, aside from misunderstandings, tend to give the work behind it for granted, tend to think that we just know history either in a way that is devaluated, like we don't actually know it, right? So that you don't have to learn it either, but in ways that skip, in fact, the process that makes us come to a conclusion which is evidenceable, is something that also the rest of the studies can rest on. And contemporary historiography has, in this sense, a massive gap within itself, to an extent which is difficult at times to even fully portray. All right. So again, probably many people, especially since yesterday's video, have come. Not many new people have come on my channel. Probably this video will receive more views for a strange law that apparently works on YouTube whenever you do these things. This is a very typical video of Schwerpunkt, typically, like in probably the way it's structured, etc. It's important, however, to look at all the rest in a sense. And so that's something that makes sense across the board, right? And really looking at, as we do in these videos, the wall, not simply just a detail, right? Details are very important. History should be learned in sort of mechanical ways, that including learning by heart. But the main deal is surely surely a beneficial one, the finding the ultimate point, the ultimate purpose. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.